The summer heat of 1943 pressed down on Cedar Ridge, Montana, like a heavy blanket. The war in Europe seemed a million miles away from this dusty farming community, where the biggest concerns were usually crop prices and whether local boys would make it back from the Pacific. But on this July afternoon, Cedar Ridge was about to face a crisis that would test everything its residents believed about justice and courage. Sarah McKenna stood in the center of the town's makeshift courthouse, the back room of Hartwell's general store, cleared of merchandise and fitted with wooden benches, her hands bound behind her back with rough rope. At 19, she was small and slight, with auburn hair and green eyes that held a mixture of fear and defiance. The accusation against her was shocking: murder. 3 days earlier, Marcus Worthington, son of the town's wealthiest landowner, had been found dead in his barn with a pitchfork through his chest. Sarah had been discovered standing over the body, her dress stained with his blood. In a town where justice was swift and trials were informal affairs, 10 men had been assembled to serve as jury and judge. "The evidence speaks for itself," declared Jeremiah Carlisle, a local rancher who had appointed himself prosecutor. Sarah McKenna was found standing over Marcus Worthington's body, covered in his blood, with the murder weapon right there. What more proof do we need? The 10 men deciding Sarah's fate were a cross-section of Cedar Ridge's male population. Doc Henderson, the town physician; Frank Morrison, the blacksmith; Tom Bradley, who ran the bank; and several farmers and shopkeepers. In the back corner, barely visible in the shadows, sat an old man most people knew simply as Old Pete. Nobody knew his real name, and he rarely spoke. He'd shown up 5 years earlier, kept to himself, and earned a living doing odd jobs. "Hold on," interrupted Doc Henderson, adjusting his spectacles. "We can't rush to judgment. Sarah's been part of this community her whole life. Her father died fighting in France last year, and her mother passed when she was 14. This girl has worked harder than most grown men." "That's exactly the point, Doc," shot back Carlisle. "She's desperate. Desperate people do desperate things. Marcus was wealthy, and everyone knows he kept cash in that barn office." Sarah found her voice, though it trembled. "I didn't kill him. I found him like that. I was coming to see him about work. He'd promised me a job with the harvest crew. When I got to the barn, the door was open, and he was already dead." "Then explain the blood on your dress," demanded Frank Morrison. "I tried to help him. I didn't know if he might still be alive. I pulled out the pitchfork and tried to stop the bleeding, but it was too late." Sarah's voice broke. "I know how it looked, but I swear on my father's grave, I didn't hurt him." The men exchanged glances, some skeptical, others showing doubt. The problem was that Cedar Ridge had no real sheriff, no trained investigators, no proper legal system. Justice was whatever the community decided it should be. "She could be lying," muttered Tom Bradley uncertainly. "Marcus had been drinking heavy lately," Doc Henderson observed quietly, "ever since he got that letter about his brother being killed at Normandy." "Maybe this wasn't murder at all. Suicide," scoffed Carlisle. "A man doesn't kill himself with a pitchfork to the chest." The debate continued for an hour, voices rising as the men argued over Sarah's fate. Some wanted to send her to the county seat for a proper trial, but that meant a 3-day journey with no guarantee of fairness. "I say we put it to a vote," announced Carlisle. "All in favor of finding Sarah McKenna guilty of murder, raise your hands." One by one, hands began to rise, Frank Morrison first, then Tom Bradley reluctantly, followed by 3 farmers. That made 6 votes for conviction. All opposed. Doc Henderson raised his hand immediately, followed by 2 others. 3 votes for acquittal. 1 man abstained. That's 6 to 3. Carlisle announced with satisfaction, "The majority finds Sarah McKenna guilty." But before he could continue with what everyone assumed would be a death sentence, a quiet voice from the back spoke up. "Hold on there, son." Every head turned toward Old Pete. In all his years in Cedar Ridge, most had never heard him speak more than a few words. "You haven't heard from me yet," the old man continued, slowly rising. "And according to what you said, all 10 men need to vote." Carlisle frowned. "Fine, old man. What's your vote? Make it quick." Old Pete stepped into the light. He was smaller than he'd seemed in the shadows, probably 5 feet 6 inches, with thin gray hair and weathered hands, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet strength that made even Carlyle step back. "Before I vote," old Pete said calmly, "I'd like to ask the young lady a few questions." The men looked at each other. Uncertainly. "I suppose that's fair," Doc Henderson said before Carlyle could object. Old Pete nodded and turned to Sarah. "Miss McKenna, you said you were going to see Marcus about work. What kind of work?" "Cooking for the harvest crew. Marcus had put word out that he needed someone to prepare meals. It paid well, and I needed the money." "Had you worked for the Worthingtons before?" "A few times. Mrs. Worthington always said I was reliable and honest." "When you found Marcus, what exactly did you see?" Sarah closed her eyes. The barn door was open, which was strange. "I called his name, but he didn't answer. When I went inside, I saw him on the floor with so much blood." "Where exactly was the pitchfork?" "Sticking out of his chest, but the angle was wrong. It looked like he'd fallen on it, or like someone had pushed him onto it." "And you pulled it out?" "I thought he might still be alive. I've seen enough injuries to know sometimes you can help if you act fast." Old Pete walked slowly around the room, hands clasped behind his back, deep in thought. "Gentlemen," he finally said, "I've been listening to your deliberations, and I'm troubled. You're about to sentence a young woman to death based on circumstantial evidence and assumptions. Get to the point, old man," Carlyle snapped. Old Pete's eyes hardened, but his voice remained calm. "The point, Mr. Carlyle, is that you're rushing to judgment, and in my experience, that's a dangerous way to dispense justice." "Your experience? What experience would that be?" "Sweeping floors." For a moment, old Pete said nothing. Then, slowly, he reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small, worn leather case. He opened it carefully and held it up for everyone to see. Inside was a metal bronze with a blue ribbon that several men recognized immediately. It was a Congressional Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration awarded by the United States. The room fell silent. "My name," old Pete said quietly, "is Peter James Harrison, Colonel, United States Army, retired. I earned this medal at Gettysburg in 1863, leading a charge that saved my regiment and helped turn the tide of the battle." The revelation hit like a thunderbolt. Here was a man they had dismissed as a simple handyman, revealing himself to be a decorated Civil War hero. "I've seen enough violence and death to last several lifetimes," Colonel Harrison continued, "and I've learned that the truth is usually more complicated than it first appears. I've also learned that rushing to judgment, especially when a person's life hangs in the balance, is the kind of mistake that haunts you forever." He turned to Sarah. "Miss McKenna, I believe your story. But more than that, I think I know what really happened to Marcus Worthington." The stunned silence stretched on as the 10 men processed what they had learned. The quiet old man they had known as Pete was actually Colonel Peter Harrison, a genuine war hero whose medal represented the highest honor their country could bestow. "That's impressive, Colonel," Carlyle finally said, though his voice had lost its earlier bluster. "But a medal from 80 years ago doesn't change the facts." "You're right," Colonel Harrison agreed. "It doesn't change the facts, but it might change how carefully we examine those facts before making a decision. That can't be undone." Doc Henderson leaned forward. "Colonel, you said you think you know what happened to Marcus. Would you share your thoughts?" "I'd be happy to, Doc. But first, I need to ask more questions." Harrison turned to the men. "How many of you have been in Marcus's barn recently?" Frank Morrison raised his hand. "I was there last week for ironwork." He was drinking heavily. Even midday. Kept talking about his brother Tom, saying it should have been him that died. Said he was tired of living while better men were dying overseas. Tom Bradley nodded. "He came to the bank 2 weeks ago, wanting to change his will. He was drunk then too, saying he didn't deserve to inherit his father's land when Tom was dead." Colonel Harrison absorbed this information. "Miss McKenna, when you found Marcus, you said the pitchfork looked like he'd fallen on it. Can you describe the scene more?" Sarah closed her eyes. "He was on his back, and the pitchfork was sticking straight up, but the handle was pointing toward his desk, not the door. And there was an overturned chair beside him. Was the pitchfork standing upright?" Yes, the tines were stuck deep enough to hold it in place. Harrison walked over and examined the rope binding Sarah's hands. Gentlemen, before we proceed, let's untie Miss McKenna. She's not going anywhere. Despite Carlisle's protests, the rope was removed. Harrison offered Sarah his chair. Now then, let's think logically. Marcus was a strong young man, probably outweighing Miss McKenna by 70 pounds. If she had attacked him, we'd expect signs of struggle, overturned furniture, defensive wounds. Blood spatter around the room. There was blood everywhere. Carlisle interjected. But was there blood spatter, or was it pooled under the body? The men looked uncertain. None had examined the scene carefully. I went back to the barn this morning, Harrison said quietly. I wanted to see the scene before making my decision. You had no right, Carlisle began. I had every right, Mr. Carlisle. I'm a jury member, and I have a responsibility to examine all evidence. His voice carried command authority. What I found was very interesting. Harrison began pacing. The blood was pooled directly beneath. Marcus, with little splatter on walls or furniture. That's consistent with a single penetrating wound, not violent struggle. The overturned chair was from behind his desk, the one he would have been sitting in. What does that prove? Demanded Morrison. Combined with other evidence, it suggests a different scenario than murder. Harrison paused. I found something else, an empty whiskey bottle, and another nearly empty. Hidden behind feed sacks. Doc Henderson whistled. That's a lot of drinking. Indeed, and there were scratch marks on the floor around his desk, as if someone had been pacing for a long time. The scratches matched Marcus's boots. The picture was becoming clearer, and several men looked uncomfortable. You're suggesting suicide, said Bradley quietly. But how does a man impale himself on a pitchfork? It's not impossible, Harrison replied grimly. I've seen men do desperate things when consumed by guilt and despair. Marcus was drunk, depressed, convinced he should have died instead of his brother. He positioned the pitchfork with tines pointing up, then threw himself onto it. That's horrible, whispered one farmer. War does horrible things to people's minds, even to those who don't fight. Marcus was carrying survivor's guilt, and alcohol made it worse. Carlisle wasn't convinced. That's speculation, Colonel. You're right. I can't prove it, beyond doubt, but I can prove Miss McKenna couldn't have committed this murder. All eyes focused on the old soldier. I spent 30 years in the Army, including 4 years of brutal war. I've examined countless battlefield wounds. The wound that killed Marcus was made by someone falling onto that pitchfork, with tremendous force, far more than a young woman could generate in an attack. He gestured toward Sarah. Look at her. She weighs maybe 110. Marcus was probably 180, 190. For her to drive a pitchfork through his chest with enough force to penetrate as deeply as it did, she would have needed leverage or momentum. The wound angle makes both impossible. Doc Henderson nodded. The Colonel's right. That pitchfork went clear through Marcus's chest into the wooden floor. That requires tremendous downward force. But what about motive? Carlisle pressed. Harrison was quiet, then spoke gently. Miss McKenna, I need to ask something, and I want complete honesty. Had Marcus Worthington ever made improper advances toward you? Sarah's face flushed red. She looked down. I don't know what you mean. I think you do. And I think that's why you were reluctant to seek work from him, despite needing money desperately. Sarah said nothing for a long moment. Then, barely audible, he tried to. He said things. Last time I worked for Mrs. Worthington, he cornered me in the pantry and tried to. She couldn't finish. Did you tell anyone? Who would believe me over Marcus Worthington? Yet you went to see him about work anyway. Why? Because I was desperate. I hadn't eaten properly in 3 days, and I was behind on rent. I thought if I was careful, but Marcus had other ideas. Sarah nodded. When I got there, he was drunk. He started making suggestions about what I could do to earn extra money. When I tried to leave, he grabbed my arm and said he wasn't done talking. What happened then? I pulled away and told him I wasn't that kind of girl. He got angry and said no one would believe I was decent, living alone like I do. He said maybe it was time someone taught me my place. The jury looked increasingly uncomfortable. Then what? He reached for me, but he was so drunk he stumbled. backward and fell over his chair. I ran toward the door, but then I heard this horrible sound. When I turned around, he was on the ground with the pitchfork. Sarah began crying, and the pieces clicked into place. Marcus positioned that pitchfork as a threat, Harrison said quietly. Maybe to frighten Miss McKenna, or maybe planning something worse. But drunk, he miscalculated. When he fell backward over his chair, he landed on his own weapon. Doc Henderson shook his head sadly. So it was an accident. A horrible, tragic accident. Miss McKenna has been the victim of terrible circumstances, but she is not a murderer, Harrison declared. He turned to the jury. Gentlemen, I call for a new vote. All in favor of acquitting Miss Sarah McKenna of all charges. One by one. Hands rose. Doc Henderson first, followed by Bradley, Morrison, and all the others, even Carlisle. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the colonel's moral authority, reluctantly raised his hand. The vote was unanimous, not guilty. Sarah collapsed in her chair, sobbing with relief. The nightmare was over. Miss McKenna, Harrison said gently, you're going to be all right. This town owes you an apology, and I intend to make sure you get it. As they walked out together, Sarah asked, why did you let everyone think you were just a handyman? Why hide who you really are? Harrison was quiet, then said, sometimes people judge you differently when they know about your past. I wanted to be accepted for who I am now, not for what I did 80 years ago. But if you hadn't revealed your mettle, they might have voted to, I know. But sometimes you have to take a stand, regardless of personal cost. That's what true courage means. As they stepped into the dusty street, Sarah realized she had been saved not just by the colonel's knowledge and authority, but by his willingness to sacrifice his anonymity for justice. It was a lesson she would never forget. Word spread quickly through Cedar Ridge that evening about what had happened in the makeshift courtroom. By sunset, half the town knew that old Pete was actually Colonel Peter Harrison, Medal of Honor, recipient and hero of Gettysburg. The other half knew that Sarah McKenna had been cleared of all charges, and that Marcus Worthington had died by his own hand accidentally. But while attempting something far worse than murder, Sarah walked home through streets that felt different now, where before she had hurried with her head down, avoiding neighbors who whispered about the murderer. Now she found people approaching with awkward apologies and offers of help. Mrs. Patterson from the dress shop stopped her. Sarah, dear, I never believed those awful rumors. If you need work, I could use help with alterations. Old Mr. Jameson tipped his hat. Miss McKenna, I owe you an apology. If you need anything food, supplies, just let me know. The kindness was overwhelming, but Sarah could see that the townspeople's guilt was as much about discovering Marcus Worthington's true character as it was about how they had treated her. Meanwhile, Colonel Harrison had retreated to his small cabin, hoping to return to the anonymity he had carefully cultivated. But privacy was a luxury he would no longer enjoy. Doc Henderson knocked on his door that evening. Colonel, I wanted to thank you for what you did today and to apologize for how this town has treated you. Harrison invited the doctor inside and poured coffee. No apology necessary, Doc. I chose to keep my past private. But why? A man with your service record could have been a leader here. From day one, Harrison settled into his chair. Tell me, Doc, what do you see when you look at me? I see a war hero, a man who served with distinction. And before today, Doc Henderson shifted uncomfortably. I saw a drifter, someone who kept to himself. Exactly. People see what they expect to see. When you're known as a hero, everything you do is filtered through that lens. Your opinions carry more weight than they should. People defer to you not because your ideas are better, but because of something you did decades ago. But surely that's better than being dismissed. Harrison was quiet. Doc, I earned that medal on July 3, 1863. I was 22, scared, and I did what needed to be done. It was 3 minutes of my life 80 years ago. Should those 3 minutes define me forever? But you saved lives. You showed extraordinary courage. I showed the courage that moment demanded. But courage isn't something you possess like a watch. It's something you choose again and again. Harrison gestured toward town. Today, Sarah McKenna showed courage by telling painful truth. You showed courage by admitting you might be wrong. That's just as heroic as anything at Gettysburg. Their conversation was interrupted by Frank Morrison, looking uncomfortable. "Colonel, sir, I voted to hang that girl today, based on nothing but assumptions. That's not the man I thought I was." "Frank, you voted based on evidence. As you understood it, when new evidence came to light, you changed your vote. That takes integrity. But I was so quick to judge. We all make mistakes, Frank. The measure of a man isn't whether he makes mistakes, it's what he does when he realizes he's made one." Over the next hour, 3 more jurors came to Harrison's door, each grappling with guilt and seeking absolution. Harrison received them all with patience, offering wisdom that comes from a lifetime of observing human nature. The last visitor was Jeremiah Carlisle, still defensive. "Colonel, I still think we followed proper procedure. The evidence pointed to the girl." Harrison studied the man's angry eyes. "You're right, Jeremiah. You followed procedure as you understood it. But are you angry because you think I manipulated things, or because you're realizing that your procedures might not have been sufficient for a matter of life and death?" Carlyle's jaw tightened. "I don't appreciate being lectured by someone who's been lying to this community. I never lied. I simply didn't volunteer information about my past. There's a difference. You let us think you were nobody special. I am nobody special, Jeremiah. I'm just a man who happened to be in the right place at the right time." Carlisle stood to leave, but Harrison's next words stopped him. "The real question is, if my medal hadn't changed your mind about Sarah's guilt, what would have? What evidence would have been enough to overcome your certainty?" Carlisle left without answering, but Harrison could see the question had hit home. The next morning brought Sarah McKenna, carrying fresh-baked bread and wearing a simple blue dress. "Colonel, I wanted to thank you properly." She offered the bread. "It's not much, but it's all I have." Harrison accepted it gratefully and invited her to sit on his porch. "How are you feeling today?" "Yesterday was quite an ordeal. Relieved, mostly, but also confused. People are being so kind now. But 3 days ago they were ready to hang me. How does a person's character change so completely in people's minds?" "Your character didn't change at all. Their understanding of the situation changed. That's why it's dangerous to judge based on incomplete information. But it's more than that. When they saw your medal, suddenly your opinion carried more weight than everyone else's combined." Harrison nodded approvingly. "You're perceptive, yes. That medal gave my words authority they wouldn't have had otherwise. The question is, was that fair?" Sarah considered this. "I don't know if it was fair, but I'm grateful. Without your medal, I might be. The truth would have come out eventually. Sarah, maybe not in time to save you from immediate harm, but eventually, truth has a way of surfacing. Do you really believe that?" Harrison looked toward town. "I've lived long enough to see that most secrets come to light. Most lies unravel. It might take time, but justice usually finds a way." "What about Marcus? Will people remember what he really was?" "That depends on this community and what they choose to do with the truth. Some will prefer to forget the uncomfortable parts. Others will face the whole truth and learn from it." Sarah was quiet, then asked, "Why did you really come to Cedar Ridge? A man with your background could live anywhere." Harrison smiled slightly. "After the war, I spent 30 years in the peacetime army. I held commands, attended ceremonies where people praised my heroism. But somewhere along the way, I realized I had stopped being the man who earned that medal and had become someone who just wore it." "What do you mean?" "I was living in the past, letting one moment of courage substitute for a lifetime of character. So I retired and came here to see if I could still be useful without the uniform and medals and reputation." "And have you been?" "I've repaired roofs, taught children to fix bicycles, chopped wood for widows. Small things, but they mattered to the people I helped. But yesterday wasn't small, no. It wasn't. But it wasn't about the medal either. It was about examining evidence carefully and having courage to speak up when I saw injustice." As Sarah walked back toward town, she reflected on the colonel's words. She had been saved by his intervention, but she was beginning to understand that he had risked something precious, his carefully guarded privacy and simple life. Over the following weeks, Cedar Ridge gradually settled back into familiar rhythms, but with subtle changes that reflected lessons learned. There was new wariness about jumping to conclusions, hesitation before embracing gossip, and greater willingness to consider alternative explanations. The transformation was perhaps most evident in how the community now viewed Colonel Harrison himself. Rather than simply deferring to his authority because of his mettle, people began listening to his actual words and considering his reasoning. The colonel doesn't want us to agree with him just because of his mettle, Tom Bradley explained to his wife. He wants us to think for ourselves. That's what real leadership looks like. As autumn arrived in Cedar Ridge, Harrison found himself reflecting on how his life had evolved since that dramatic courtroom day. He had revealed his identity to save Sarah McKenna, but in doing so, he had also revealed something important about the nature of heroism and authority. True leadership wasn't about having people follow you blindly, it was about helping them develop wisdom and courage to make good decisions on their own. His mettle had given him authority to save Sarah's life, but the greater victory was how the community had grown from the experience. The lesson of that summer day in 1943 wasn't the dramatic courtroom revelation. It was the quiet transformation of a community that learned to think more carefully, judge more fairly, and understand that heroism was not a destination, but a journey that began anew with each sunrise. 6 months after the dramatic events in Cedar Ridge's makeshift courtroom, the small Montana town had settled back into familiar rhythms, but with changes that reflected hard-learned lessons. The war continued to dominate headlines, but residents now read those reports with deeper understanding of how quickly circumstances could change, and how important it was to reserve judgment until all facts were known. Sarah McKenna had not only survived her ordeal, but emerged stronger and more determined. The job at Mrs. Patterson's dress shop had led to steady work, and Sarah's skill had made her indispensable. More importantly, the trial had revealed her resilience to the entire community, as she found herself sought out for advice by other young women facing difficulties. "Miss Sarah," said Mary Beth Wilson, whose father had been injured in a farming accident, "I don't know how to manage everything. Everyone keeps telling me what to do, but they all have different ideas." Sarah looked up from the wedding dress she was altering. 6 months ago, she would have offered tentative suggestions. Now, tempered by her experience, she spoke with quiet authority. "Mary Beth, the most important thing I learned is that you have to trust your own judgment. Even when others think they know better, listen to advice, but make your own decisions." "But what if I make the wrong choice? Then you'll learn from it and make a better choice next time. That's how we grow stronger." Meanwhile, Colonel Harrison had found that his revealed identity brought both benefits and complications. People treated him with greater respect and sought his counsel, but they also expected him to have answers about everything. "Colonel," said Frank Morrison, approaching as Harrison repaired a fence, "we've got a situation at the school board meeting. Disagreement about hiring the new teacher. We could use your wisdom." Harrison paused in his work. "Frank, what do you think about the new teacher?" "Well, I haven't really thought about it much. That's why we need your experience." "But you've met her, seen her credentials, yes, but then you have everything you need to form an opinion. You don't need me to tell you what to think." Harrison resumed hammering, then looked up. "Frank, one dangerous thing about having a mettle is that people think it gives you special wisdom about everything. But my mettle was for military courage, not educational policy. Your judgment about teachers is just as valid as mine." This was a conversation Harrison had regularly. People who had ignored his opinions for 5 years now sought them constantly, not because his insights had changed, but because their perception of his authority had changed. The most significant change in Cedar Ridge was harder to quantify but impossible to miss. There was new wariness about jumping to conclusions, hesitation before embracing gossip, and greater willingness to consider alternative explanations. This new caution was tested when another crisis rose in December 1943. Timothy Chen, the 13-year-old son of the Chinese family that ran the laundry, was found with a bloody nose and torn clothes behind the schoolhouse. He claimed he had fallen, but other children said Billy Patterson, son of a prominent farming family, had been bullying him a year earlier. the community would likely have chosen sides quickly, with most supporting the Patterson family due to their prominence. The Chen family, as relative newcomers and one of only two non-white families in town, would have found few defenders, but the McKenna case had taught Cedar Ridge to be more careful about assumptions based on social status. We need to hear from both boys before we decide what happened, Doc Henderson told the gathered parents. We need to remember that there are often more sides to a story than we initially realize. The investigation was thorough. Both boys were interviewed separately, witnesses questioned, physical evidence examined. What emerged was a complex story of long-simmering tensions and the challenges faced by families who were different. Timothy had indeed been the victim of ongoing harassment, not just from Billy Patterson, but from several boys who targeted him because of his race. Billy had been the ringleader, but he was also under pressure from friends to prove his toughness. When confronted with evidence, Billy's father, Robert Patterson, reacted with anger and denial. My son wouldn't do such a thing. The Chen boy is probably lying. You know how these people can be. The room fell silent at Patterson's casual racism. 6 months earlier, such a comment might have gone unchallenged. But the memory of how quickly the community had turned against Sarah McKenna was still fresh. Colonel Harrison, sitting quietly in back, slowly rose. Bob, I think you need to be very careful about making statements like that. Colonel, you don't understand the situation. These people came to our town and expect us to change everything. No. Bob, you're the one who doesn't understand. Harrison walked to the front, his presence filling the space. The Chen family came to Cedar Ridge because they're Americans, just like you and me. They work hard, pay taxes, and contribute to this community. Their son has every right to attend school without being terrorized. But you can't just take the word of what, Bob? A fellow American, a neighbor, a child who deserves our protection. The confrontation was uncomfortable but necessary. Patterson eventually backed down, more from social pressure than genuine change of heart. Billy was disciplined, and measures were put in place to prevent further harassment. People are thinking more carefully before they speak, observed Mrs. Patterson. They're asking themselves whether what they're about to say is fair. It's not perfect. Sarah replied, some people haven't changed at all, but enough have changed to make a difference. The transformation was perhaps most evident in how the community now viewed Colonel Harrison. Rather than simply deferring to his authority, people had begun to listen to his actual words and consider his reasoning. As winter settled over Cedar Ridge, Harrison reflected on the unexpected ways his life had evolved. He had revealed his identity to save Sarah McKenna, but in doing so, he had also revealed something important about the nature of heroism and authority. True leadership wasn't about having people follow you blindly. It was about helping them develop wisdom and courage to make good decisions on their own. On Christmas Eve, 1943, Cedar Ridge held its annual community celebration. The gathering was smaller. Too many young men were overseas, but there was a warmth that hadn't been present in recent memory. Sarah McKenna stood before the assembled crowd to read from the Christmas story, a role that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. Her clear voice filled the hall as she read about hope, redemption, and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to find truth. Colonel Harrison sat in the back row, watching his neighbors and feeling grateful for the strange journey that had brought him here. He thought about the young man he had been at Gettysburg, and how that terrified 22-year-old could never have imagined this moment. After the service, Timothy Chen approached Harrison with a carefully wrapped package. Colonel Harrison, sir, my family wanted to give you this as thanks for what you did at school. Harrison unwrapped it to find a beautifully crafted wooden box, clearly made by hand with extraordinary skill. My father made it, Timothy explained proudly. He said, a man who stands up for what's right deserves something special. Harrison examined the box, noting the intricate joinery and smooth finish that spoke of hours of patient work. Timothy, this is beautiful, but you don't need to thank me. I was just doing what any decent person should do. That's what makes it special, sir. You didn't do it because you had to, you did it because it was right. As Harrison walked home through snow-covered streets that Christmas Eve, he carried not just the wooden box, but a deeper understanding of what his Medal of Honor truly represented. It wasn't a symbol of past glory, it was a reminder of the choice he had made at Gettysburg to do what was right despite danger, and a challenge to keep making that choice every day. In his cabin, Harrison opened the wooden box. Inside, nestled in soft cloth, was a simple note written in careful English for a man who shows us that real heroes don't need medals to do what's right. Harrison smiled and carefully placed his Medal of Honor in the box alongside the note. Both represented the same thing, not past accomplishments, but ongoing obligations. Outside, snow continued to fall on Cedar Ridge, covering the town in white that made everything look clean and new. It was fitting for a community that had learned to see past assumptions and prejudices, to question first impressions, and to understand that true heroism wasn't about grand gestures, but about the daily choice to do what was right. 10 men had once voted to hang an innocent girl because they were afraid to look beyond surface events, but one quiet old man had shown them that courage wasn't about medals or recognition. It was about the willingness to seek truth, admit mistakes, and stand up for justice even when it came at personal cost. The real legacy of that summer day in 1943 wasn't the dramatic revelation or vindication. It was the quiet transformation of a community that learned to think more carefully, judge more fairly, and understand that heroism was not a destination, but a journey that began anew with each sunrise.